Grace never thought the day would come when she'd be standing outside her own father's wedding, uninvited. 2 years ago, Grace held her mother's hand as she took her last breath, promising she'd always take care of Dad. Robert was lost without his wife. For months, he barely left the house, barely spoke to anyone. Then he discovered online dating. At first, Grace was happy he was trying to move forward with his life. When Robert met Victoria, everything changed. She was charming, beautiful, and seemed to bring him back to life. But something about Victoria felt wrong from the moment they met. Call it intuition, call it jealousy. Robert called it jealousy. Victoria had this way of talking to Robert that made him hang on her every word, slowly turning him against everyone who cared about him. 6 months later, Robert called with news that shattered Grace's world. Victoria and I are getting married, and we've decided to keep it small. When Grace pressed him about what small meant, the truth came out. She wasn't invited to her own father's wedding. 24 hours before the wedding, Grace sat in her car outside his house, crying like she hadn't cried since her mother's funeral. But grief turned to determination. If Victoria was hiding something, Grace was going to find it. Detective James confirmed Grace's worst fears. Victoria wasn't who she claimed to be. 3 different identities for previous marriages, all to wealthy widowed men who lost their life savings. Mrs. Henderson was Victoria's last victim. She lost her late husband's entire pension and nearly lost her home. When Grace tried to warn Robert one final time, he gave her an ultimatum: accept Victoria or lose him forever. The wedding day arrived. Grace had a choice: respect her father's wishes and stay away, or fight for the man who raised her. Grace chose to fight. With Detective James and a folder full of evidence, she walked into that church. The ceremony had already begun. Victoria looked radiant in her white dress, playing the perfect bride. But Victoria had no idea that her past was about to catch up with her in front of 150 wedding guests. What happened next changed everything, not just for Robert and Victoria, but for every person in that church. But before we reveal how this story ends, we'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments below. Hit that like button if you're invested in this story. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible family stories that prove love truly conquers all. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday evening. Grace had been planning to help with wedding preparations when Robert delivered the devastating news. Sweetheart, Victoria and I have decided to keep the wedding intimate. Just immediate family. Grace's heart stopped. She was his only child, his immediate family. The silence stretched between them as the reality sank in. After 32 years of being Daddy's little girl, she was being excluded from the most important day of his new life. How could her own father choose a woman he'd known for 6 months over his daughter? Grace felt like she was living in a nightmare, watching her relationship with her father crumble before her eyes. What Grace didn't know was that Victoria had been working on Robert for weeks. Honey, don't you think Grace seems a little jealous of our happiness? Maybe it would be better if we started our new life without any negative energy from people who clearly don't want us to succeed. Victoria's voice was honey, but her intentions were poison. She had perfected the art of manipulation, making her suggestions sound like loving concern while systematically isolating Robert from everyone who truly cared about him. Every conversation was carefully calculated to turn him against Grace, painting his daughter as the villain in their love story. Victoria knew exactly which emotional buttons to push to make Robert choose her over his family. Grace remembered their first meeting 3 months earlier. Victoria had smiled sweetly, but her eyes remained cold and calculating. She asked probing questions about Robert's finances, his late wife's jewelry, the value of the house, his retirement accounts. At the time, Grace thought Victoria was just getting to know the family and their history. Now those questions felt sinister and predatory. Victoria had been evaluating Robert's worth like a predator sizing up prey, calculating exactly how much she could take from this vulnerable widower who was still grieving his beloved wife. Every seemingly innocent question had been part of a larger scheme to assess whether Robert was worth the effort of her elaborate deception. The warning signs had been there during their weekly family dinners. Victoria would interrupt whenever Grace tried to share memories about her mother, dismissing them as living in the past. She changed the subject when Grace mentioned family traditions they used to share, suggesting new modern ways to celebrate instead. Slowly but surely, Victoria was erasing Grace from her father's life, and Robert was too infatuated to notice the manipulation happening right in front of him. Each dinner became more uncomfortable as Victoria's true nature showed through her perfect facade, but Robert only saw what she wanted him to see. Grace felt like she was losing her father to a stranger who was rewriting their family history. Grace drove straight to her father's house after the phone call, hoping to make him understand the magnitude of what he was doing. "Dad, I'm your daughter, your only child. How can you get married without me there? Mom will be heartbroken." Robert's face showed pain, but his words cut deeper than any knife. "Grace, you've been nothing but hostile toward Victoria since day one. This is supposed to be the happiest time of my life, and you're making it difficult with your jealousy and negativity." Victoria emerged from the kitchen with a sympathetic smile that didn't reach her cold eyes. "Oh, Grace, I'm so sorry you're upset. Maybe someday you'll understand that we just want what's best for your father's happiness and future." That night, Robert stared at his late wife's photo on the nightstand, feeling torn between past and future. Margaret had always been such a good judge of character, able to see through people's facades instantly. What would she think about Victoria? But the loneliness had been so overwhelming since her death, consuming him like a black hole. Victoria made him feel young again, desired again, worthy of love. He pushed away the nagging doubts about Grace's concerns, telling himself that his daughter was just struggling to accept that he was moving on. Victoria said Grace was jealous, unable to accept that he deserved happiness again. Maybe it was time to choose his future over his past, even if it meant hurting his only daughter in the process. Grace spent the next 3 days in her apartment, looking through family photos and trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. Pictures of her, Robert, and her mother at Christmas mornings, birthday celebrations, graduation ceremonies. They had been such a close, loving family. Her mother had always said that family comes first, no matter what challenges life throws your way. But now Robert was choosing Victoria over the daughter who had stood by him through the darkest period of his life, who had held his hand at the funeral, who had checked on him every single day. The betrayal felt deeper than any wound Grace had ever experienced, cutting straight through her heart and soul. Grace met with Mrs. Patterson, her mother's best friend and the wisest woman she knew, hoping for guidance in this impossible situation. "Honey, your father is grieving and vulnerable, and some women specifically prey on that kind of emotional pain for their own gain." Mrs. Patterson's words echoed Grace's own deepest fears. "Your mother would want you to protect him, even if he can't see the danger right now. Sometimes love means fighting for someone even when they're pushing you away and breaking your heart." Those words gave Grace the strength and clarity she needed to take action, even if it meant risking her relationship with her father forever. Her mother's memory demanded nothing less than complete protection of the man they both loved. Grace made one final, desperate attempt to reach her father's heart and mind. "Dad, please just postpone the wedding for a few months. Give yourself more time to really get to know Victoria, to see if this is real love or just loneliness driving you." But Robert's response was cold, final, and devastating. "Grace, Victoria makes me happy in a way I haven't felt since your mother died. She brings light back into my life. If you can't support that happiness, then maybe you shouldn't be part of my new life at all." The line went dead, and Grace realized that her father had made his choice definitively. Now she had to make hers, knowing it might destroy their relationship forever. That night, Grace made a decision that would change everything and set the course for the most important investigation of her life. If her father wouldn't listen to her concerns about Victoria, maybe she needed to find concrete, undeniable proof of what her instincts were screaming. She opened her laptop and began searching for everything she could find about Victoria Miller, digging deeper than surface-level social media profiles. What she was about to discover would shock her to the core and potentially save her father from a fate far worse than loneliness. Sometimes a daughter's love means becoming a detective, even when the truth might cost her everything she holds dear. Grace's investigation began at midnight, fueled by determination and desperation. She started with basic searches for Victoria Miller, but quickly realized how common the name was. Hundreds of results appeared, but none seemed to match the woman who was about to become her stepmother. Victoria's social media profiles were surprisingly sparse for someone in her 30s, with most photos dating back only 8 months. Her employment history was vague, listing freelance consulting without specifying any companies or clients. Red flags were already appearing, but Grace needed concrete evidence that would convince her father. She decided to dig deeper, using every resource at her disposal to uncover the truth about the woman who had stolen her father's heart. As Grace delved deeper into Victoria's online presence, disturbing inconsistencies began to emerge. Victoria claimed to be from Portland, Oregon, but her accent occasionally slipped into what sounded like a southern drawl. Her LinkedIn profile showed a gap of 3 years with no explanation, and her professional references led to disconnected phone numbers. Most troubling of all, Grace found a wedding announcement from 2 years ago featuring a woman who looked remarkably similar to Victoria, but with brown hair and the name Veronica Martinez. The woman in the photo was marrying a wealthy businessman from Arizona who had recently lost his wife. Grace's heart raced as she realized she might be looking at evidence of a pattern, but she needed more proof before she could approach anyone with her suspicions. Grace's research led her to Detective James Morrison, a fraud specialist with the local police department. She had found his name in online articles about romance scams targeting elderly people. Detective Morrison, I think my father might be involved with a woman who isn't who she claims to be. James listened intently as Grace presented her findings about Victoria's inconsistent background. These types of cases are more common than you'd think, he said gravely. Professional romance scammers often target recently widowed men who are emotionally vulnerable and financially stable. He agreed to run a preliminary background check on Victoria Miller, warning Grace that the process might take several days. Time was running short with the wedding only a week away. Detective James's initial searches confirmed Grace's worst fears. Victoria Miller had no credit history before 18 months ago, no tax records, and no verified employment history. Even more disturbing, facial recognition software matched her photo to 3 different women with different names in various databases. Your instincts were right, James told Grace during their follow-up meeting. This woman has been using multiple identities across several states. We're dealing with someone who's very experienced at this kind of deception. He showed Grace police reports from Arizona and Nevada involving women matching Victoria's description who had allegedly defrauded elderly men out of substantial sums of money. The evidence was mounting, but they needed more concrete proof to build a case that would convince Robert and potentially law enforcement. That evening, Grace tried once more to warn her father about her discoveries. Dad, I've been doing some research on Victoria, and there are some things that don't add up about her background. Robert's voice grew cold and defensive immediately. Grace, this is exactly the kind of behavior that convinced us you shouldn't be at the wedding. You're obsessing over Victoria because you can't accept that I'm moving on with my life. When Grace tried to explain about the inconsistencies in Victoria's story, Robert cut her off. I don't want to hear any more of your conspiracy theories. Victoria warned me you might try something like this. The line went dead, leaving Grace more determined than ever to protect her father, even if he didn't want her protection. Detective James called Grace back to the station with significant news. We've identified your Victoria Miller. Her real name appears to be Vanessa Montgomery, and she's wanted for questioning in connection with at least 4 cases of elder fraud across 3 states. The files painted a horrifying picture of a sophisticated predator who specifically targeted recently widowed men through online dating sites. Her method was always the same: sweep them off their feet with romance, isolate them from family and friends, then convince them to sign over assets before disappearing. The Arizona victim lost his entire retirement savings, James explained. In Nevada, She convinced a man to take out a second mortgage on his house just weeks before she vanished. Grace felt sick, realizing how close her father was to becoming the next victim. Armed with concrete evidence from Detective James, Grace drove to her father's house for what she knew would be the most important conversation of their relationship. She practiced her words carefully, knowing she would have only one chance to break through Victoria's manipulation and reach her father's rational mind. The folder beside her contained police reports, photographs, and documented evidence of Victoria's criminal history. Grace knew that confronting her father with this information might destroy their relationship forever if he refused to believe her, but she couldn't stand by and watch him become another victim. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. Sometimes love means doing the hard thing, even when it hurts. Grace steeled herself for the battle ahead. The confrontation at Robert's house was explosive. Grace spread the police reports and photographs across the coffee table, while Victoria watched from the kitchen doorway. "Dad, the woman you're planning to marry is a criminal. Her real name is Vanessa Montgomery, and she's wanted for fraud in multiple states." Robert's face flushed with anger as he swept the papers aside. "I can't believe you stooped this low, Grace. Making up lies, forging documents. Your mother would be ashamed of you." Victoria stepped forward with tears in her eyes, playing the victim perfectly. "Robert, honey, I'm so sorry you have to see your daughter like this. I told you she might try to sabotage our happiness, but I never imagined she'd go this far." Grace watched in horror as her father chose to believe the woman who was about to destroy his life over his own daughter. Back at the police station, Detective James and Grace strategized their next move. "Your father is under her psychological control," James explained. "It's called trauma bonding, and it's very common in these situations. Victoria has made him emotionally dependent on her while isolating him from anyone who might threaten their relationship." He showed Grace case studies of similar situations where family members had tried unsuccessfully to warn victims. "We need irrefutable evidence that even she can't explain away. I'm going to contact my colleagues in Arizona and Nevada to see if any of the victims would be willing to identify her." Grace realized they were running out of time, with the wedding only 4 days away. Every moment that passed brought her father closer to financial and emotional ruin. That night, Grace lay awake staring at the ceiling, wrestling with an impossible decision. Her father had made it clear that any further interference would result in permanent estrangement. Victoria was too skilled at manipulation for Robert to see through her lies, even when presented with evidence. Grace realized that saving her father might cost her their relationship forever, but losing him to a criminal who would destroy his life was unthinkable. As dawn approached, Grace made a decision that would change everything. She would gather every piece of evidence possible and make one final stand at the wedding itself. If her father was determined to marry Victoria, he would do so knowing exactly who she really was, even if it meant Grace lost him forever in the process. Detective James called Grace early the next morning with breakthrough information. "We've confirmed Victoria's real identity through fingerprint analysis from a coffee cup she discarded. Her name is Vanessa Montgomery, and she's been running this scam for over 5 years." The evidence was overwhelming. Police reports from Arizona, Nevada, and California detailed her methodical targeting of widowed men. Each case followed the same pattern: whirlwind romance, isolation from family, financial manipulation, then disappearance. In Arizona alone, she stole over $200,000 from Harold Brennan, James explained. The man lost his house and is now living with his sister. Grace felt a chill realizing how perfectly Victoria had replicated her strategy with Robert. The case files revealed Victoria's sophisticated methods in disturbing detail. She maintained multiple online dating profiles under different names, each carefully crafted to appeal to recently widowed men over 50. Her approach was always psychological. She studied obituaries to identify potential targets, then researched their deceased wives to mirror their personalities and interests. She told Harold Brennan she loved gardening just like his late wife did, James pointed out. With Robert Martinez in Nevada, she claimed to share his passion for classic cars. Grace realized with horror that Victoria had probably researched her mother's interests to manipulate her father more effectively. Every shared moment, every connection Robert felt, had been calculated and false. Detective James arranged video calls with Victoria's previous victims, hoping their testimonies would provide irrefutable evidence. Harold Brennan, the Arizona victim, was heartbreaking to watch. "She made me feel alive again after my Martha died," he said through tears. "Victoria was so understanding, so loving. She said we were soulmates, that Martha would have wanted me to be happy." His voice cracked as he described how Victoria convinced him to liquidate his retirement accounts for a business investment that never existed. "I lost everything, my house, my savings, my dignity. But worse than the money was realizing that everything I felt was real was just a lie." Grace knew her father was heading for the same devastating fate. Armed with victim testimonies and police reports, Grace made another desperate attempt to reach her father. "Dad, please just listen to me for 5 minutes. I have people who can prove Victoria isn't who she claims to be." But Robert's response was even more hostile than before. "Grace, I'm done with your harassment. Victoria is the best thing that's happened to me since your mother died, and I won't let you destroy that." When Grace tried to mention the other victims, Robert exploded. "You're sick, Grace, creating elaborate fantasies because you can't accept my happiness. Victoria warned me you might get this desperate, but I didn't believe her." The conversation ended with Robert's ultimatum: "Stop this madness, or you're no longer my daughter." Desperate for legal options, Grace consulted with family attorney David Chun, who had handled her mother's estate. "Unfortunately, Grace, your father is mentally competent and free to make his own decisions, even poor ones," he explained sympathetically. "Unless we can prove Victoria is actively defrauding him right now, there's no legal grounds for intervention." He reviewed the evidence Grace had gathered with Detective James. "This is compelling proof of her criminal history, but it doesn't constitute legal grounds to stop the marriage." Grace felt the walls closing in as Chun continued. "Your best hope is to present this evidence publicly in a way that forces your father to confront the truth before it's too late." Detective James worked overtime trying to build a case strong enough to arrest Victoria before the wedding. "I'm coordinating with law enforcement in Arizona and Nevada to see if we can get an arrest warrant issued," he told Grace during their late-night strategy session. "The problem is jurisdictional. Her crimes were committed in other states, and the evidence we have here is mostly circumstantial." He had been in contact with FBI fraud specialists who confirmed Victoria was on their radar, but admitted that romance scam cases were notoriously difficult to prosecute. "These women are experts at staying just within legal boundaries until they make their final move," James explained. Time was running out with the wedding just 2 days away. That night, Grace spread all the evidence across her living room floor like a detective working a murder case. Police reports, victim photographs, financial records, testimonials. Everything painted a clear picture of Victoria's criminal enterprise. But none of it mattered if she couldn't make her father see the truth. Grace realized that her only option was to confront Victoria publicly at the wedding ceremony itself, where she couldn't control the narrative or manipulate the situation. It was a desperate plan that would either save her father or destroy their relationship forever. Grace picked up her mother's photograph from the mantel. "Mom, I need your strength tomorrow. Help me save Dad, even if he hates me for it." What Grace didn't know was that Victoria was accelerating her timeline. That same day, she had convinced Robert to make temporary changes to his financial accounts for tax purposes related to their marriage. The bank manager, concerned about the large transactions, had tried to suggest Robert consult with his family before making such significant changes. "My daughter and I aren't speaking right now," Robert admitted sadly. Victoria squeezed his hand supportively. "Honey, once Grace sees how happy we are, she'll come around. Family relationships heal with time." But Victoria's sympathetic words masked her urgency. She needed access to Robert's assets before anyone could stop her. The next morning brought devastating news from Detective James. "We couldn't get the arrest warrant in time. The other jurisdictions need more time to process the paperwork, and Victoria hasn't technically committed any crimes in our state yet." Grace felt her last hope slipping away as James continued, "But I've been authorized to attend the wedding as backup. If you can present the evidence publicly and she tries to flee or makes any threats, we can intervene." It was a long shot, but it was all they had. Grace would have to walk into that church knowing she was about to either save her father's life or lose him forever. The weight of that responsibility was crushing, but her love for Robert gave her the strength to continue. On the morning of the wedding, Grace stood before her mirror, holding the folder that contained everything she discovered about Victoria's true identity. Her hands trembled as she thought about the magnitude of what she was about to do. In a few hours, she would walk into her father's wedding uninvited and potentially destroy the last relationship that meant everything to her. But Harold Brennan's tearful face haunted her thoughts, along with the other victims who had trusted and lost everything. Grace kissed her mother's wedding ring, which she wore on a chain around her neck. "Help me do this right, Mom. Help me save Dad, even if it costs me everything." She picked up the evidence folder and headed toward the most important confrontation of her life. The ultimatum from her father hit Grace like a physical blow, leaving her feeling more alone than she'd ever felt in her entire life. For 32 years, Robert had been her anchor, her protector, her biggest supporter through every challenge life had thrown her way. He had taught her to ride a bike, walked her down the aisle at her college graduation, and held her when she cried after bad breakups. Now he was choosing a criminal over his own daughter, threatening to cut her out of his life forever if she continued trying to protect him from obvious danger. Grace sat in her empty apartment, surrounded by mountains of evidence that could save her father's life, but completely powerless to make him listen to reason. The silence was deafening as she realized that tomorrow's wedding might be the last time she ever saw the man who had raised her with such love and devotion. The weight of potentially losing both parents within 2 years was crushing her spirit, but she couldn't abandon him to Victoria's manipulation, even if it meant sacrificing their relationship forever. Grace's mind drifted to 5 years ago when her mother was battling cancer, and the family had faced their darkest hour together as a united front. Robert had never left Margaret's side during those agonizing months, sleeping in uncomfortable hospital chairs and refusing to go home even when the doctors insisted he needed rest. "We're a team, the three of us," he had told Grace during one of those long, terrifying nights when they thought they might lose her. "No matter what life throws at us, we face it together as a family. That's what makes us strong." Margaret had made them both promise to always look out for each other, to never let anything or anyone come between their bond as father and daughter. "Promise me you'll always be there for each other, no matter what happens to me," she had whispered with her dying breath, her weak hands squeezing both of theirs. Grace had held on to that promise for 2 years, treasuring it as a sacred vow, but now it felt like she was the only one honoring her mother's final wish. How could Robert have forgotten those sacred words so quickly? The emotional toll of the past week had left Grace physically and mentally exhausted, running on nothing but adrenaline and determination. She hadn't been sleeping more than 2 hours a night, barely eating anything substantial, and the constant stress was manifesting in headaches and shaking hands. As she tried to make a simple cup of tea, Grace found herself breaking down completely for the first time since this nightmare began. The tears came in waves as she realized the magnitude of what she was facing. Not just losing her father to a criminal, but potentially losing him forever because he refused to see the truth. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "Sometimes the people we love most make the worst decisions when they're hurting." Margaret had always been the wise one, the peacemaker who could see through people's facades and find the right words to heal any situation. Grace desperately wished her mother was there to guide her through this impossible situation, to help her find a way to save Robert without destroying their relationship in the process. Grace picked up her parents' wedding photo from the mantel, studying their young, hopeful faces and remembering the love story that had shaped her entire childhood. Robert and Margaret had met in college and were inseparable for 35 years until cancer took her away. They had weathered every storm together: financial struggles, career setbacks, family tragedies. But their love had only grown stronger through each challenge. Margaret used to say that real love meant protecting each other from harm, even when it was difficult or uncomfortable. Love isn't just about the good times, sweetheart, she had told Grace. Real love means being willing to fight for someone even when they can't see the danger themselves. Grace realized that her mother would absolutely want her to fight for Robert, even if it meant risking everything they had built together. The question was whether Grace had the courage to honor that legacy, knowing it might cost her the last family she had left in the world. Grace stared at her father's contact information on her phone, her thumb hovering over the call button as she wrestled with whether to make one final attempt to reach him before the wedding. Part of her wanted to pour out her heart, to remind him of all the memories they shared, all the promises they had made to her mother about staying close. But she knew that Victoria had poisoned his mind so thoroughly that any contact from her would only reinforce his belief that Grace was jealous and manipulative. Detective James had warned her that victims of romantic manipulation often became more defensive when family members tried to intervene, viewing it as an attack on their judgment rather than an act of love. The painful truth was that Robert was so emotionally invested in Victoria that he literally couldn't afford to believe the evidence against her, because it would mean admitting that everything he felt was real was actually a carefully constructed lie. Grace set the phone down, knowing that tomorrow's confrontation at the church would be her only chance to break through Victoria's psychological hold on her father. Meanwhile, Detective James was working through the night, making calls to law enforcement agencies across the country to build the strongest possible case against Victoria. His conversation with Detective Maria Santos in Phoenix had been particularly enlightening about Victoria's methods and psychology. She's one of the most sophisticated romance scammers we've ever encountered, Santos had explained. She studies her targets for months before making contact, learning their vulnerabilities, their deceased spouses' personalities, even their financial situations through public records and social media. James learned that Victoria had a network of accomplices who helped her research potential victims and create believable backstories. The scary thing is how good she is at making these men feel genuinely loved, Santos continued. By the time they realize what's happening, they've lost everything and she's moved on to the next victim. James knew that Grace was fighting not just against one criminal, but against a professional organization that had perfected the art of emotional manipulation. As the hours ticked toward her father's wedding day, Grace lay in bed staring at the ceiling and running through every possible scenario for tomorrow's confrontation. She had rehearsed her words 100 times, imagining how she would present the evidence in a way that even Victoria couldn't explain away or dismiss. But she also had to prepare for the very real possibility that Robert would choose Victoria over the truth, that he would look at the evidence and still decide that Grace was lying to sabotage his happiness. The thought of watching her father make that choice in front of 150 wedding guests was almost unbearable, but Grace knew she had no other option. Mrs. Patterson's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes love means being willing to be the villain in someone else's story if it means protecting them from real harm. Grace prayed that if her mother was watching from heaven, she would give her the strength to do what needed to be done, regardless of the personal cost. The morning of the wedding arrived gray and overcast, matching Grace's somber mood as she prepared for what might be the most important day of her life. Her hands shook as she made coffee, knowing that in just a few hours she would either save her father from financial and emotional ruin or lose him forever in front of an entire congregation. She had chosen her outfit carefully, professional but not threatening, respectful but confident, knowing that her appearance would matter when she stood up to challenge Victoria publicly. The folder containing all the evidence sat on her kitchen counter like a loaded weapon, ready to either liberate her father or destroy their relationship permanently. Grace said a prayer for wisdom and courage, asking God to help her find the right words and the right moment to reveal the truth about Victoria. She knew that once she walked into that church, there would be no turning back from the path she had chosen to honor her mother's memory and protect the man she loved most in the world. Grace sat in her car outside St. Mark's Episcopal Church, watching early wedding guests arrive and feeling the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. This was the same church where her parents had been married 35 years ago, where she had been baptized as a baby, where they had held her mother's funeral just 2 years before. The irony of having to save her father in the same place where they had said goodbye to her mother was not lost on her. She watched Victoria's hired wedding photographer setting up equipment and realized how carefully planned this whole charade was. Victoria wanted documentation of her latest conquest, proof of her successful manipulation for whatever twisted satisfaction it brought her. Grace took a deep breath, picked up the evidence folder, and stepped out of her car. Detective James was already positioned near the back of the church, ready to intervene if things went wrong. It was time to honor her mother's final request and fight for her father, no matter what it cost her personally. As Grace walked toward the church entrance, she felt her mother's presence with her like never before, as if Margaret was walking beside her and giving her strength for the battle ahead. The evidence folder felt heavy in her hands, but not as heavy as the knowledge that her father's entire future hung in the balance of the next few hours. She knew that Victoria was inside right now, putting on her white dress and preparing to play the role of loving bride one more time, completely unaware that her past was about to catch up with her in front of everyone who mattered to Robert. Grace paused at the church doors, said one final prayer for wisdom and courage, and stepped inside to face the most important confrontation of her life. Everything she had discovered, all the evidence she had gathered, all the love she felt for her father, it all came down to this moment. She was ready to fight for him, even if it meant losing him forever in the process. Detective James had worked through the night to coordinate with Victoria's previous victims, and the morning of the wedding brought a breakthrough that would change everything. Mrs. Eleanor Henderson, the elderly woman from Arizona who had lost her life savings to Victoria, agreed to participate in a video call to help save Robert from the same fate. "I can't let another family go through what mine did," she said with determination despite her frail appearance. "That woman destroyed my late husband's legacy and nearly cost me my home. But if my testimony can save your father, then some good can come from my suffering." Detective James explained that Mrs. Henderson would be available by video call during the confrontation if needed, providing real-time testimony that Victoria couldn't dismiss or explain away. Grace felt a surge of hope knowing that she wouldn't be facing this battle alone, that other victims were willing to stand up and help expose Victoria's criminal enterprise. At Detective James's suggestion, Grace met in person with another of Victoria's victims, Mrs. Dorothy Mills from Nevada, who had driven through the night to help. "She took everything from me. My husband's pension, our savings, even convinced me to mortgage our paid-off house," Dorothy said through tears. "But the worst part wasn't losing the money. It was realizing that everything I felt was real. The companionship, the love, the hope for the future was all a calculated lie." Dorothy showed Grace photos of the modest apartment where she now lived after losing her family home of 40 years. "Your father seems like a good man from what Detective James told me. I won't let her destroy another family if I can help it." Grace was moved by the courage of these women who were willing to relive their trauma to save a stranger, and she knew their testimonies would be impossible for even Robert to ignore. Back at her apartment, Grace meticulously organized all the evidence into a presentation that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. She had police reports from 3 states, financial records showing Victoria's pattern of theft, photographs of her with different identities, and now personal testimonies from real victims who had lost everything. The folder was thick with documentation that painted an undeniable picture of Victoria's criminal enterprise. Grace practiced her presentation one final time, knowing she would have only minutes to present the evidence before Victoria tried to control the narrative or Robert's emotions overrode his logic. She included photographs of the victims' homes before and after Victoria's schemes, showing the devastating real-world consequences of her manipulation. This wasn't just about proving Victoria was a liar. It was about showing Robert the human cost of her crimes and what his own future looked like if he proceeded with the marriage. Meanwhile, at the church, Victoria was putting the finishing touches on her bridal appearance, completely unaware that her carefully constructed world was about to collapse around her. She had chosen an expensive white dress using Robert's credit card, playing the part of the blushing bride to perfection. Her phone buzzed with a text from her accomplice confirming that the final financial transfers would be processed during their honeymoon. By the time Robert realized what had happened, she would be in another state with another identity. Victoria smiled at her reflection, thinking about how easy this mark had been compared to some of her previous targets. Robert's grief had made him particularly vulnerable, and his estrangement from his daughter had eliminated the biggest threat to her plan. She had no idea that Grace had spent the past week building an ironclad case against her, or that multiple law enforcement agencies were now coordinating to bring down her entire operation. Detective James arrived at the church early to coordinate with backup officers who were positioned discreetly around the building. He had briefed them on Victoria's history of fleeing when confronted with evidence, and they were prepared to prevent her escape if she tried to run. Remember, we're dealing with someone who's evaded capture for years by manipulating people's emotions, he told his team. She's going to try every psychological trick in the book to control this situation once she realizes what's happening. James had also coordinated with the FBI's fraud division, who were standing by to take Victoria into custody once she was publicly exposed. The net was closing around her, but James knew that the most critical part of the operation would be Grace's ability to present the evidence in a way that broke through Robert's emotional defenses and made him see the truth about the woman he was about to marry. As Grace drove toward the church for the second time that morning, she felt a strange sense of calm settling over her despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. She had done everything possible to prepare for this moment, gathered irrefutable evidence, coordinated with law enforcement, secured testimony from multiple victims, and planned her presentation down to the smallest detail. The outcome was now out of her hands. She could only trust that the truth would be powerful enough to break through Victoria's manipulation and reach her father's heart. Grace thought about her mother's unwavering faith in doing the right thing, even when it was difficult or costly. Courage isn't the absence of fear, sweetheart, Margaret had once told her. Courage is doing what's right even when you're terrified of the consequences. Grace was terrified, but she was also ready to honor her mother's memory by fighting for her father's life and future. Grace positioned herself near the back of the church, watching Robert's friends and colleagues arrive for what they believed would be a joyous celebration. Many of them approached her with confused expressions, wondering why the bride's stepdaughter-to-be was sitting alone instead of participating in the ceremony. "Grace, dear, shouldn't you be up front with the family?" asked Mrs. Williams, Robert's longtime neighbor. Grace managed a weak smile and deflected their questions, knowing that in less than an hour these same people would witness one of the most dramatic confrontations of their lives. She watched Victoria's supposed friends and family members arrive, people Grace had never met despite Victoria's claims of having deep roots in the community. Everything about Victoria's side of the wedding felt staged and artificial, from the rent-a-crowd guests to the generic decorations that showed no personal touches or meaningful connections. Pastor Mitchell was making final preparations for what he believed would be a sacred celebration of love and new beginnings. He had counseled Robert through his grief after Margaret's death and was genuinely happy to see him finding love again. The pastor had noticed some tension between Robert and Grace, but attributed it to normal family adjustment struggles. He had no idea that he was about to officiate what would become one of the most dramatic wedding interruptions in the church's history. Pastor Mitchell said a prayer for the couple's happiness and future together, completely unaware that one half of that couple was a professional criminal who had destroyed multiple families across the country. The irony of performing a sacred ceremony for someone who made a living destroying the sanctity of love and marriage would haunt him for years to come. In the bridal preparation room, Victoria was making final arrangements with her criminal accomplice over the phone. "Everything's in place," she whispered while the makeup artist worked on her lipstick. "The honeymoon account is ready, and I'll trigger the transfers tonight from the hotel. By Monday morning, I'll be Sarah Thompson in Oregon, and Robert will be figuring out how to explain to his bank why his accounts are empty." Victoria felt no guilt about the devastation she was about to inflict on Robert or the cruel irony of destroying him in the same church where he had married his beloved Margaret. To her, Robert was just another mark in a long line of vulnerable men who deserved what they got for being foolish enough to trust a beautiful woman. She had no idea that Grace's investigation had uncovered not just her criminal history, but her entire network of accomplices, and that law enforcement was closing in on all of them simultaneously. As the church filled with guests, Robert stood at the altar greeting friends and trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in his stomach about Grace's absence from his special day. Part of him desperately wanted to call her, to bridge the gap that had opened between them, but Victoria's words echoed in his mind about protecting their happiness from negative influences. He told himself that Grace would come around eventually, that family relationships could heal with time and patience. Robert had no idea that his daughter was sitting in the back of the church with evidence that would either save his life or destroy their relationship forever. He adjusted his tie nervously and smiled at the guests, completely unaware that in the next few minutes his entire world would be turned upside down by revelations that would force him to choose between the woman he thought he loved and the daughter he had raised with such devotion and care. The morning of the wedding brought an urgent development that Grace knew nothing about. Victoria had convinced Robert to meet her at the bank before the ceremony to finalize some paperwork for their joint future. The bank manager, David Chun, looked uncomfortable as he reviewed the documents that would give Victoria access to Robert's retirement accounts, investment portfolio, and home equity line of credit. "Mr. Wilson, these are significant financial changes," Chun said carefully. "Are you certain you want to proceed without consulting with your family or financial advisor first?" Robert's face tightened with embarrassment. "My daughter and I aren't speaking right now, and Victoria will be my wife in a few hours. This is what married couples do. They share their financial futures." Victoria squeezed his hand supportively, playing the loving fiancé perfectly while internally calculating the exact amount she would transfer to offshore accounts during their honeymoon. The paperwork would give her complete access to over $800,000 in assets that Robert had spent a lifetime accumulating. Victoria masterfully accelerated the signing process, using every psychological trick she had perfected over years of financial manipulation. "Honey, I know this feels overwhelming, but it's just a formality," she cooed while placing her hand over his as he hesitated with the pen. "When two people truly love each other, they don't keep secrets about money. This shows that you trust me completely, and that means everything to me after how badly I was hurt in my previous relationship." She had spent weeks laying the groundwork for this moment, telling Robert stories about her fictional ex-husband who had hidden assets and betrayed her trust. "I promise you, darling, I would never do anything to hurt you or take advantage of your generosity. This is about building our life together on a foundation of complete honesty and shared dreams." Robert signed the documents, telling himself he was proving his love and commitment, completely unaware that he was signing away his financial security to a woman who had destroyed dozens of families across multiple states. Grace's phone buzzed with an urgent call from Detective James just as she was preparing to enter the church for the ceremony. "Grace, we have a problem." His voice was tense with urgency. "Our contact at the bank just called. Victoria convinced your father to sign financial documents this morning that give her access to his accounts. She's moving faster than we anticipated." Grace felt her blood run cold as James continued. "If we don't stop this wedding today, your father could lose everything within hours of saying I do." The documents were structured to allow immediate transfers, which means she's planning to clean out his accounts tonight. The stakes had just escalated beyond emotional manipulation to immediate financial devastation. Grace realized that she wasn't just trying to save her father from eventual heartbreak. She was literally racing against time to prevent him from losing his home, his retirement, and every penny he had saved over a lifetime of hard work. The weight of that responsibility was crushing, but it also filled her with fierce determination to succeed. Inside the church, Robert was greeting guests and trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling that had settled in his stomach after the morning's financial transactions. Several old friends asked about Grace's absence, and each inquiry felt like a knife twisting in his heart. "She's going through a difficult time accepting my new relationship," he explained repeatedly, the words feeling hollow even to himself. Robert kept glancing toward the back of the church, hoping against hope that Grace would appear and they could reconcile before he started this new chapter of his life. His late wife Margaret had always been the one to smooth over family conflicts, and her absence felt particularly acute on this day, when family harmony seemed so elusive. Robert told himself that once he and Victoria were married and settled into their new life together, he would find a way to repair his relationship with Grace. He had no idea that his daughter was sitting just 20 feet away, armed with evidence that would shatter every assumption he had made about the woman he was about to marry. In the bridal preparation room, Victoria was making final arrangements for the financial transfers that would occur immediately after the ceremony. "Everything's in place," she whispered into her phone while adjusting her veil. "The accounts are accessible as of this morning, and I'll initiate the transfers from the hotel tonight while he's sleeping off the wedding celebration. By Monday morning, the money will be in the Cayman accounts, and I'll be Sarah Thompson heading to Oregon." Her accomplice confirmed that the new identity documents were ready and that a car would be waiting at the hotel to spirit her away before Robert realized what had happened. Victoria felt no remorse about the devastation she was about to inflict on a man who had shown her nothing but love and kindness. To her, Robert was just another mark who deserved what he got for being foolish enough to trust a beautiful woman with a sob story. She had perfected the art of targeting vulnerable widowers, and Robert had been easier to manipulate than most of her previous victims. Pastor Mitchell called for the ceremony to begin, completely unaware that he was about to witness one of the most dramatic confrontations in the church's 100-year history. The organ music swelled as guests took their seats, and Robert positioned himself at the altar, looking nervous but happy despite the absence of his only child. The pastor had performed hundreds of weddings over his 20-year ministry, but he had never officiated a ceremony where the bride was a wanted criminal and the groom was about to be financially destroyed. He opened his Bible to the passage about love being patient and kind, having no idea how cruelly ironic those words would prove to be in the context of what was about to unfold. The peaceful sanctuary was about to become the stage for a battle between truth and deception, between a daughter's love and a criminal's greed, between justice and manipulation. Pastor Mitchell said a silent prayer for the couple's happiness, completely unaware that his prayer would be answered in the most unexpected way possible. Grace sat in the back pew reviewing her evidence folder one final time, knowing that in a few minutes she would either save her father's life or lose him forever. The folder contained police reports from 3 states, financial records showing Victoria's pattern of theft, photographs of her using different identities, and testimony from multiple victims who had lost everything to her schemes. Grace had organized the evidence in a logical sequence that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away, starting with the most recent crimes and building to the devastating personal testimonies that showed the human cost of Victoria's manipulation. She said a silent prayer for courage and wisdom, asking God to help her find the right words to break through her father's emotional defenses and make him see the truth. The church was filling with a soft murmur of conversation and anticipation, but Grace felt like she was sitting in the eye of a hurricane, waiting for the moment when she would have to stand up and shatter everyone's expectations about this supposedly joyous occasion. The wedding march began, and Victoria appeared at the back of the church in her elaborate white dress, playing the role of blushing bride to perfection. She had hired actors to play her bridesmaids, and even a fake father figure to walk her down the aisle, since her real family had disowned her years ago when they discovered her criminal activities. The entire wedding party was part of her elaborate deception, paid to help maintain the illusion that she was a normal woman with normal relationships and a normal past. As she walked down the aisle, Victoria smiled radiantly at Robert, who looked at her with such genuine love and adoration that even some of the hired actors felt uncomfortable participating in the charade. Grace watched this performance with growing anger, seeing how perfectly Victoria had orchestrated every detail to manipulate her father's emotions and make him feel like he was living in a fairy tale romance. The woman walking toward the altar wasn't just a criminal. She was a master manipulator who had turned Robert's grief and loneliness into weapons against his own judgment and self-preservation. Pastor Mitchell began the ceremony with the traditional words about gathering together in the sight of God to witness the union of Robert and Victoria in holy matrimony. Marriage is a sacred covenant, he intoned, built on love, trust, and mutual respect between two people who have chosen to share their lives completely with each other. The irony of those words wasn't lost on Grace, who knew that Victoria was incapable of love, trust, or respect, and that she had chosen to share Robert's life only long enough to steal everything he had worked for. Robert stood at the altar beaming with happiness, completely unaware that the woman beside him was already planning his financial destruction and emotional devastation. The guests smiled and dabbed at their eyes, moved by what they believed was a beautiful second-chance love story, having no idea they were witnessing the final act of an elaborate criminal enterprise that had destroyed families across the country. As Pastor Mitchell reached the part of the ceremony where he asked if anyone had objections to the marriage, Grace felt her mother's presence with her like never before, giving her the courage to stand up with the evidence folder in her hands. The entire congregation turned to look at her in shock, and she could see the mixture of anger and pain that flashed across her father's face when he realized she had come to the wedding after being explicitly uninvited. Victoria's expression shifted from surprise to cold calculation as she realized that her carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down around her. "I object to this marriage," Grace said in a clear, strong voice that carried throughout the sanctuary, "because the woman my father is about to marry is not who she claims to be, and I have evidence that will prove she's a criminal who has destroyed multiple families across the country." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of shocked gasps from the congregation and the rustle of papers as Grace opened the folder that contained the truth about Victoria's real identity and criminal past. The silence that followed Grace's objection was deafening, broken only by the soft rustle of pages as she opened the evidence folder that would either save her father or destroy their relationship forever. Every eye in the sanctuary was fixed on her as she walked slowly down the aisle, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. "Dad, the woman you're about to marry is not Victoria Miller from Portland, Oregon," Grace announced, her words echoing through the church with devastating clarity. "Her real name is Vanessa Montgomery, and she's wanted by police in Arizona, Nevada, and California for defrauding elderly men out of their life savings." Robert's face went white with shock and anger, while Victoria maintained her composure with the skill of someone who had faced similar confrontations before. The congregation began murmuring in confusion and disbelief, unable to process that this beautiful wedding was about to become a criminal expose. Detective James positioned himself near the exits, ready to prevent Victoria from fleeing when she realized her carefully constructed world was collapsing around her. Robert stepped toward Grace with a mixture of fury and heartbreak etched across his face, his voice shaking with emotion as he struggled to process his daughter's public accusation. "Grace, how could you do this? How could you humiliate me and Victoria in front of our friends and family with these ridiculous lies?" His words cut through her heart like a knife, but Grace pressed forward with the evidence, knowing this was her only chance to save him. Victoria immediately began playing the victim with Oscar-worthy performance, tears streaming down her face as she reached for Robert's arm. "Oh, darling, I'm so sorry your daughter is doing this to us on our special day. I know she's been struggling with jealousy, but I never imagined she would stoop to making up such horrible stories." Victoria's voice trembled with perfectly calculated emotion as she addressed the congregation. "I don't know why Grace feels the need to destroy our happiness, but these accusations are completely false and deeply hurtful." The guests were torn between sympathy for what appeared to be a devastated bride and confusion about the serious nature of Grace's allegations. Grace refused to be deterred by Victoria's performance, pulling out the first piece of concrete evidence that would begin to unravel the web of lies. "This is a police report from Phoenix, Arizona, dated 18 months ago," she announced, holding up the official document for everyone to see. "It details how Vanessa Montgomery defrauded Harold Brennan out of his entire retirement savings after convincing him to marry her following his wife's death from cancer. The congregation gasped as Grace continued. And this is a photograph of the woman who married Harold Brennan. Notice the same facial features, same build, but with brown hair instead of blonde. She held up both images side by side, and even from a distance, the resemblance was unmistakable. Victoria's confident expression began to crack slightly as she realized that Grace had done far more investigation than she had anticipated. Robert stared at the photographs with growing confusion, his mind struggling to reconcile the evidence with his emotional attachment to the woman he believed he loved. Detective James quickly set up a laptop and projection screen that had been pre-positioned for this moment, and Mrs. Eleanor Henderson's face appeared before the entire congregation via video call. "Hello, Mr. Wilson," she said with a gentle but firm voice that commanded immediate attention. "I'm sorry to meet you under these circumstances, but I couldn't let another family suffer what mine has endured." The congregation fell silent as this dignified elderly woman began her testimony. "The woman standing beside you at that altar destroyed my life and stole everything my late husband worked 50 years to build. She convinced me that we were soulmates, that God had brought us together to heal each other's loneliness." Mrs. Henderson's voice grew stronger as she continued, "But it was all a lie designed to gain access to my finances. She took my home, my savings, my dignity, and my faith in human goodness. Please don't let her do the same to you." The impact of hearing directly from a victim was devastating, and several guests began pulling out their phones to record this unprecedented testimony. Victoria's carefully maintained facade began to crack under the weight of the mounting evidence, but she quickly regrouped and launched a counterattack designed to undermine Grace's credibility. "This is obviously a coordinated attack by Grace and her accomplices," Victoria declared with righteous indignation. "She's been obsessed with destroying our relationship from the beginning, and now she's recruited actors and forged documents to try to break us up." She turned to Robert with tears in her eyes, her voice breaking with perfectly rehearsed emotion. "Darling, you know how much I love you. You know that everything we've shared together has been real and beautiful. Please don't let your daughter's jealousy and mental instability destroy what we've built together." Victoria was gambling that Robert's emotional attachment to her would override the evidence, and that his anger at Grace's public confrontation would cloud his judgment. For a moment, it seemed like her manipulation might work, as Robert looked torn between the woman he thought he loved and the daughter who was trying to save him. But Grace wasn't finished presenting her evidence. Mrs. Dorothy Mills appeared on the screen next, her voice steady despite the obvious pain of reliving her trauma for the sake of saving a stranger. "Mr. Wilson, I drove all night from Nevada to help save you from the same fate I suffered at this woman's hands," she began, her dignity evident despite her circumstances. "She convinced me to mortgage my paid-off home of 40 years for what she claimed was a business investment that would secure our future together. Instead, she disappeared with everything, leaving me homeless and heartbroken at 74 years old." Dorothy held up a photograph of the modest apartment where she now lived. "I lost the home where I raised my children and buried my husband, but if my story can save your family from the same devastation, then some good can come from my suffering." The congregation was visibly moved by Dorothy's courage and dignity, and even some of Victoria's hired wedding party began shifting uncomfortably as they realized they were participating in something far more sinister than they had been told. Robert stared at the accumulating evidence with dawning horror as the reality of his situation began to penetrate his emotional defenses. The photographs, the police reports, the heart-wrenching testimony from multiple victims. It was becoming impossible to dismiss as coincidence or fabrication. "Victoria," he said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper, "tell me this isn't true. Tell me you're not the same woman who destroyed these people's lives." Victoria realized that her usual manipulation tactics weren't working and that she needed to escalate her emotional appeal to maintain control of the situation. "Robert, darling, you know me," she pleaded, reaching for his hands. "You know the woman who held you when you cried about missing Margaret, who listened to your stories about Grace as a little girl, who made you feel alive again after 2 years of grief. That woman is real, and she loves you with all her heart. But even as she spoke, Robert was noticing details he had been too emotionally invested to see before. The slight changes in her accent when she was stressed, the way her stories about her past never quite aligned, the questions about his finances that had seemed natural at the time but now felt calculated and predatory. Detective James received confirmation that backup units were in position around the church and that FBI agents specializing in romance fraud were standing by to take Victoria into custody. The coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies represented months of investigation into Victoria's criminal network, and this public exposure was the culmination of a carefully planned operation to bring down her entire organization. All units. Suspect is contained in the church sanctuary with approximately 150 witnesses, James radioed to his team. Subject has extensive history of fleeing when confronted, so maintain perimeter security. The detective knew that Victoria's criminal expertise included knowing exactly when to abandon a scheme and disappear, and he wasn't going to let her escape to victimize another family. Federal warrants have been issued for her arrest in multiple states, and her capture would finally bring justice to the many families she had destroyed over the years. James watched the confrontation unfold, ready to move in the moment Victoria made any attempt to flee or became violent in response to being exposed. Grace presented the final devastating piece of evidence that would seal Victoria's fate and save her father's financial future. Dad, this morning Victoria convinced you to sign documents giving her access to your retirement accounts, your investment portfolio, and your home equity line, she announced, producing copies of the paperwork that Detective James had obtained from the bank. The total value is over $800,000. Everything you and Mom worked your entire lives to build. Robert's hands shook as he looked at the documents, finally understanding the full scope of what was happening to him. These papers were designed to allow immediate electronic transfers, which means Victoria was planning to steal everything tonight while you slept off your wedding celebration. The congregation erupted in shocked murmurs as the true magnitude of the attempted crime became clear. Victoria realized that her situation had become untenable and began looking toward the exits, calculating her chances of escape before law enforcement could apprehend her. Robert turned to face Victoria with a mixture of heartbreak and fury, holding the financial documents that represented her planned betrayal of his trust and love. Is this true, Victoria? Were you planning to steal everything I have and disappear? His voice cracked with emotion as 2 years of grief and loneliness crystallized into the devastating realization that he had been manipulated by a professional predator. Victoria made one final desperate attempt to maintain her psychological hold over him. Robert, you're letting your unstable daughter destroy the most beautiful thing that's ever happened to both of us, she pleaded, her voice taking on a harder edge as her desperation grew. Choose love over fear. Choose our future over her jealousy and lies. But the evidence was too overwhelming, the pattern too clear, and Robert's awakening too complete for her manipulation to work any longer. Get away from me, he said quietly, stepping back from the woman who had nearly destroyed his life. Grace, I'm so sorry. You were trying to protect me, and I almost threw away the most important relationship in my life for a lie. The congregation watched in stunned silence as the truth finally triumphed over deception, and a daughter's love saved her father from devastating ruin. The moment Victoria realized that her manipulation had failed and Robert had seen through her deception, she made a desperate break for the side exit of the church, abandoning all pretense of being an innocent victim. Detective James and his team moved swiftly to intercept her, their coordination flawless after months of planning for this moment. Vanessa Montgomery, you're under arrest for fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy, James announced as Victoria was surrounded by officers near the church's side door. The congregation watched in stunned silence as the beautiful bride in white was handcuffed and read her rights, the elegant wedding dress a stark contrast to the criminal reality being revealed. Victoria's hired wedding party began slipping out the back exits, realizing they had been paid to participate in an elaborate criminal scheme. The dramatic transformation from fairy tale wedding to criminal arrest was surreal for everyone present, but particularly devastating for Robert, who was witnessing the complete collapse of everything he thought he knew about the woman he had almost married. With Victoria in custody and being led away by police, Robert stood alone at the altar in his wedding tuxedo, the full weight of his near catastrophe settling over him like a crushing wave. His hands trembled as he processed how close he had come to losing everything: his life savings, his home, his dignity, and most importantly, his relationship with his daughter. Grace approached him slowly, uncertainty written across her face as she wondered whether he would forgive her for the public humiliation or blame her for destroying what he thought was his chance at happiness. The congregation watched this private family moment unfold in the sacred space where so many joyful celebrations had taken place, but where today truth and justice had triumphed over deception and greed. Robert looked at his daughter with tears streaming down his face, seeing her clearly for the first time in months, not as the jealous obstacle Victoria had painted her to be, but as the loving protector she had always been, willing to risk everything to save him from devastation. Robert stepped toward Grace with his arms open, his voice breaking with emotion as he spoke the words that had been building in his heart since the truth was revealed. "Grace, my darling daughter, I am so deeply sorry for everything I put you through," he said through tears that had been held back for months. "You were trying to protect me, and I almost lost the most precious thing in my life because I was too blind to see the truth." Grace fell into her father's arms, both of them sobbing with relief and gratitude that their relationship could be healed and that he had been saved for Victoria's scheme. "I was so scared I was going to lose you forever, Dad," Grace whispered against his shoulder. "I couldn't let her destroy you the way she destroyed those other families." The congregation, many of whom had known the Wilson family for years, wiped away their own tears as they witnessed this powerful reconciliation between father and daughter. It was a moment of grace and forgiveness that transformed what could have been a tragedy into a testament to the power of family love and sacrifice. Pastor Mitchell, who had been stunned into silence during the dramatic confrontation, stepped forward to address the shaken congregation with words of comfort and perspective. "Friends, we have witnessed something extraordinary today," he began, his voice steady despite the unprecedented circumstances. "We have seen evil exposed and justice served, but more importantly, we have seen the triumph of love over deception and family loyalty over manipulation." The pastor looked directly at Robert and Grace as he continued. "Sometimes God uses the most difficult circumstances to reveal his protection and grace in our lives. Today, a daughter's courage and a father's awakening have prevented a tragedy and restored a family." The congregation began to murmur their agreement, understanding that they had witnessed something far more significant than a disrupted wedding. They had seen a family saved from destruction through the power of truth and unconditional love. Pastor Mitchell offered a prayer of thanksgiving for grace and protection, and for the law enforcement officers who had worked tirelessly to bring a dangerous criminal to justice. Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Mills, still connected via video call, expressed their profound gratitude for finally seeing justice served and another family saved from Victoria's schemes. "Mr. Wilson, seeing your daughter fight for you the way she did gives me hope that maybe my own grandchildren will forgive me for being so foolish," Mrs. Henderson said with tears of relief. "Thank you, Grace, for having the courage to do what our families couldn't. You stopped her before she could complete her destruction." Mrs. Mills nodded in agreement, adding, "Watching Victoria get arrested today brings me more peace than I've felt since I lost my home. Knowing that she can't hurt anyone else makes all of our suffering worthwhile." The congregation listened to these testimonies with deep respect for the courage these elderly women had shown in coming forward to help save a stranger. Their willingness to relive their trauma to prevent others from suffering demonstrated the power of community and solidarity in the face of evil. Robert asked to speak with both women personally, wanting to thank them for their bravery and to learn from their experiences. As the immediate drama subsided, members of the congregation began approaching Grace and Robert to express their admiration for Grace's courage and their relief that Robert had been saved from such a terrible fate. "Grace, your mother would be so proud of the woman you've become," said Mrs. Williams, Robert's longtime neighbor who had watched Grace grow up. "It took incredible strength to stand up in front of all of us and risk everything to save your father." Other church members shared similar sentiments, praising Grace's determination and investigative skills. "We all thought Victoria seemed too good to be true," admitted Mr. Peterson, "but none of us had the courage or the resources to dig deeper like you did." The community support was overwhelming and healing for both Grace and Robert, who had felt so isolated during the weeks of conflict leading up to the wedding. They realized that their church family had been concerned all along, but hadn't known how to express their doubts or offer help. The experience brought the entire congregation closer together and reinforced the importance of looking out for one another. Outside the church, Detective James was coordinating with FBI agents and giving statements to local media who had arrived after hearing reports of a dramatic arrest at a wedding ceremony. This case represents the successful coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies to bring down a sophisticated criminal organization, James explained to reporters. Vanessa Montgomery, also known as Victoria Miller and several other aliases, has been operating across multiple states for over 5 years, targeting vulnerable widowed men and stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars. The detective emphasized the importance of family members trusting their instincts when something doesn't feel right about a new romantic relationship. Grace Wilson's courage and determination not only saved her father from financial ruin, but also helped us apprehend a dangerous criminal who had evaded capture for years. The media coverage would help warn other potential victims and encourage families who suspected similar situations to contact law enforcement. James also announced that Victoria's accomplices were being rounded up in coordinated arrests across several states. As the crowds dispersed and the media attention died down, Robert and Grace sat together in the front pew of the now quiet church, both emotionally exhausted but profoundly grateful for the outcome of this traumatic day. "I keep thinking about how close I came to losing everything," Robert said quietly. "Not just the money, but my self-respect, my judgment about people." Grace took his hand, feeling the weight of the past few weeks beginning to lift from her shoulders. "Dad, you weren't foolish. You were grieving and lonely, and she was a professional who specialized in exploiting those exact vulnerabilities." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both reflecting on how their relationship had been tested and ultimately strengthened by this crisis. "Your mother always said that sometimes the worst things that happen to us reveal the best things about the people who love us," Robert observed. "Today I learned that I raised a daughter with more courage and wisdom than I ever possessed." Grace smiled through her tears, feeling her mother's presence in the peaceful sanctuary where their family had worshipped for so many years. Pastor Mitchell joined Robert and Grace in the front pew, offering pastoral counsel and spiritual perspective on the day's extraordinary events. "I've been ministering for 20 years, and I've never seen anything quite like what happened here today," he said with genuine amazement. "But I've also never seen such a clear example of how love and truth can triumph over evil and deception." The pastor helped them process the spiritual dimensions of their experience, emphasizing how Grace's willingness to risk everything for her father reflected the kind of sacrificial love that God calls all families to demonstrate. "Your mother is smiling down from heaven today," Pastor Mitchell told them both. "She raised a daughter who would fight for family with the same fierce loyalty that she showed throughout her life." He offered to provide ongoing counseling to help them rebuild their relationship and process the trauma of nearly losing each other to Victoria's manipulation. The peaceful conversation in the sanctuary helped them begin to heal from the emotional wounds of the past few weeks and look forward to rebuilding their bond. As the afternoon sun streamed through the stained glass windows, Robert and Grace stood together before the small memorial display that honored Margaret's life and contributions to the church community. "I think Mom knew this day was coming somehow," Grace said softly, "and she made sure I would have the strength to fight for you when you couldn't fight for yourself." Robert nodded, feeling his late wife's presence strongly in this sacred space where they had shared so many important moments as a family. She always said that real love means protecting the people you care about, even when they can't see the danger, he reflected. Today you showed me what that kind of love looks like in action. They stood in peaceful silence, both feeling that their family circle was complete again despite Margaret's physical absence. The crisis had revealed the depth of their bond and proved that their love for each other was stronger than any outside force trying to divide them. As they prepared to leave the church and begin rebuilding their relationship, they knew that this experience had made them both wiser, stronger, and more grateful for the family love that had saved them both from devastating loss. 3 months had passed since the dramatic wedding that never was, and Robert's house felt like a home again for the first time since Margaret's death. The walls that had been stripped of family photos during Victoria's subtle campaign to erase the past were now filled with memories of happier times. Pictures of Robert, Margaret, and Grace at Christmas mornings, birthday celebrations, and family vacations. Grace visited twice a week now, and their coffee conversations had become a cherished ritual of rebuilding their relationship brick by brick. "I started therapy last week," Robert admitted to his daughter, his voice steady but humble. Dr. Sarah Chun specializes in helping people recover from psychological manipulation. "She's helping me understand how Victoria was able to control my thoughts and emotions so completely." Grace reached across the table to squeeze his hand, proud of his courage in facing the painful reality of how he had been deceived. The healing process was slow but steady, and both father and daughter were committed to rebuilding the trust and communication that had sustained them through Margaret's illness but had been nearly destroyed by Victoria's calculated interference. In his weekly therapy sessions, Robert was learning to process the complex emotions of shame, anger, and betrayal that had consumed him since Victoria's arrest. "It's important to understand that you weren't weak or foolish," Dr. Chun explained patiently. "Romance scammers like Vanessa are psychological experts who study grief and loneliness the way doctors study diseases. They know exactly how to exploit the specific vulnerabilities of recently widowed people." Robert was beginning to forgive himself for falling victim to such sophisticated manipulation, understanding that Victoria had targeted him precisely because his grief made him an ideal mark. She studied Margaret's obituary, researched our family through social media, and crafted a personality designed to fill the exact void that losing my wife had created, he reflected with growing clarity. The therapy was helping him distinguish between his genuine grief for Margaret and the artificial emotions Victoria had manufactured to control him. Most importantly, he was learning to rebuild his confidence in his own judgment and his ability to form healthy relationships in the future. Grace had maintained regular contact with Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Mills, the brave women whose testimony had been crucial in exposing Victoria's crimes. Their video calls had evolved from formal victim statements into genuine friendships built on shared experience and mutual support. "Grace, dear, you've given us something we thought we'd lost forever," Mrs. Henderson said during one of their weekly chats. "Hope that justice can actually prevail and that good people will fight for each other when it matters most." Mrs. Mills had become particularly close to Grace, seeing in her the kind of fierce family loyalty that her own children had failed to show during her crisis. "You remind me that there are still people in this world who will risk everything to protect the ones they love," Dorothy said with deep affection. These relationships had become a source of healing for all three women, proving that even the worst experiences can create bonds of strength and solidarity. Grace was helping both women navigate the legal process of potentially recovering some of their stolen assets now that Victoria's criminal network had been dismantled. Detective James called Grace and Robert to the police station to update them on the broader investigation that had grown out of Victoria's arrest. Vanessa Montgomery's capture led us to a network of at least 12 other romance scammers operating across 15 states, he reported with satisfaction. "We've recovered over $2 million in stolen assets and arrested 17 people involved in various aspects of the operation." The scope of the criminal enterprise was staggering. Victoria had been part of a sophisticated organization that included identity forgers, financial experts, and even actors who played supporting roles in the elaborate deceptions. Your case became the key that unlocked everything, James told them. Grace's investigation and the evidence you gathered gave us the breakthrough we needed to bring down the entire network. Robert learned that he had been one of over 40 men currently being targeted by various members of the organization, and that Grace's intervention had likely saved multiple families from devastation. The detective presented them with a commendation from the FBI for their crucial role in exposing and dismantling such a dangerous criminal operation. On the 3-month anniversary of the wedding that never was, Robert and Grace visited Margaret's grave together for the first time since the crisis began. They brought fresh flowers and spent time sharing memories of the woman who had been the heart of their family for so many years. "I think Mom somehow knew what was coming," Grace said as they arranged the bouquet on the headstone. "She made sure I would have the strength to fight for you when you couldn't see the danger clearly." Robert nodded, feeling his wife's presence strongly in the peaceful cemetery where so many of their friends and family members had been laid to rest. "She always said that protecting the people you love sometimes means making difficult choices," he reflected. "You honored her memory by refusing to give up on me, even when I made it nearly impossible for you to help." They stood in comfortable silence, both feeling that Margaret would be proud of how they had fought to preserve their family bond despite Victoria's attempts to destroy it. The visit represented a turning point in their healing process and a renewed commitment to honoring Margaret's legacy of unconditional family love. Grace had begun volunteering with a community organization that educated elderly people about romance scams and other forms of financial fraud targeting seniors. Her firsthand experience with Victoria's sophisticated manipulation tactics made her an effective advocate for awareness and prevention. The most important thing to remember is that these criminals are experts at making you feel like you're the only person who understands them, she explained to a group of recent widows and widowers. "They study your social media, your deceased spouse's obituary, even your community involvement to create a false personality that seems perfectly compatible with yours." Grace shared her father's story with permission, emphasizing that intelligence and education were no protection against such psychological manipulation. "My father is a successful businessman who raised me to be skeptical and careful, but grief made him vulnerable in ways he never anticipated," she told the group. "The key is having family and friends who feel comfortable expressing concerns and having the wisdom to listen when people who love you worry about your safety." Her presentations had already helped several families recognize and prevent similar schemes. Robert had spent considerable time working with financial advisors and legal experts to repair the damage that Victoria's brief access to his accounts had caused. Although Detective James and the FBI had prevented her from completing the massive theft she had planned, some smaller transactions had gone through before her arrest. "We've recovered about 60% of what was taken," his financial advisor reported, and the FBI expects to recover more as they liquidate assets from the criminal organization. Robert was grateful for the professional help in rebuilding his financial security, but more importantly, he had learned valuable lessons about protecting himself from future manipulation. He had implemented new safeguards requiring family consultation for any major financial decisions and had joined a support group for victims of romance scams. "The money was important, but it wasn't the most valuable thing I almost lost," he reflected. "Grace's love and our family bond are irreplaceable. I almost threw that away for a lie." His experience had made him a more cautious but also more grateful person, with a deeper appreciation for the real relationships in his life. The regular phone calls between Grace and Robert had become a treasured part of both their daily routines, replacing the tense conversations of the Victoria era with comfortable discussions about work, friends, and shared memories. "I'm making Mom's pot roast recipe for Sunday dinner," Grace told her father during one of their evening chats. "Would you like to come over and help me make sure I get it right?" These simple invitations had become precious opportunities to rebuild their relationship through shared activities and family traditions that Victoria had tried to eliminate. Robert had begun teaching Grace some of Margaret's recipes that she had never learned, ensuring that family traditions would continue into the next generation. Your mother always said that cooking together was how families stay connected across generations, Robert observed as he accepted the dinner invitation. She would love knowing that we're keeping her recipes and her wisdom alive through our relationship. The healing power of returning to normal family rhythms had been crucial in their recovery from the trauma of nearly losing each other. Robert and Grace had begun attending church together again, finding comfort in the spiritual community that had supported them through Margaret's illness and had witnessed their dramatic reconciliation 3 months earlier. Pastor Mitchell often used their story as an example of how love and truth can triumph over deception and evil, always with their permission and always emphasizing the lessons rather than the sensational details. The Wilson family's experience reminds us that sometimes God's protection comes through the courage of those who love us enough to fight for our well-being. He had preached the previous Sunday. Grace's willingness to risk everything to save her father demonstrates the kind of sacrificial love that reflects God's own heart. Sitting together in the same pew where they had worshipped as a family for so many years, both Robert and Grace felt their mother's presence and her approval of how they had fought to preserve their family bond. The church community had embraced them with renewed warmth and support, understanding that their experience had made them both wiser and more compassionate people. As autumn arrived and the leaves began to change, Robert and Grace spent a quiet evening organizing family photo albums and sharing stories about Margaret that kept her memory alive in their daily conversations. "You know what I've learned through all of this?" Grace said as she placed a favorite wedding photo of her parents back on the mantel. "Real love isn't just about the good times and romantic feelings. Real love means being willing to fight for someone even when they can't see the danger themselves, even when it might cost you everything that matters to you." Robert smiled at his daughter's wisdom, recognizing Margaret's influence in the strong, courageous woman Grace had become. "Your mother raised you to understand that family means never giving up on each other, no matter how difficult the circumstances become," he replied. "You saved my life in every way that matters, financially, emotionally, and spiritually. I'm grateful every day that she taught you to fight for the people you love." As they sat together in the comfortable living room filled with memories and renewed hope, both father and daughter understood that their experience had made their bond stronger than ever before. They had learned that sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about romance at all, but about families who refuse to let anything destroy the connections that matter most. The warmth of their restored relationship was a testament to the power of truth, courage, and unconditional family love that endures through every trial life can bring.